Okay, so we are looking at ecology, a little bit of an overview, as well as how matter and energy are going to move through the ecosystem. So hopefully by the end of this little video, you will be able to describe each of the levels of ecological organization. So just like we've been looking at in the Blue Book, compare and contrast the movement of matter versus energy within that ecosystem, and explain how matter and energy movements can be shown or diagrammed. So we've already talked a little bit about what these levels of ecological organization are. And when we talk about ecology, what we're talking about is the study of organisms as well as their environment, really looking at how different organisms and different populations are interacting with each other and with the environment overall. At the lowest level, we can look at individuals of a particular species, and when we're looking at all of the individuals of one species in an area, that is what is going to make up the population level. So if you're an ecologist, you can study things about how populations grow and how they compete for different resources and mates, things like their average birth and death rates. All of those are going to be important to understand about a population in order to understand what impacts it has. But for right now, you can go ahead and just make sure you know that a population is a group of individuals in a given area. And so when you take a whole bunch of populations and put them together in an area, obviously there is no one population that lives completely in isolation. That is when you are going to have a community. So all the different living things, all the different species in an area make up the community. And just like we talked about with populations, there are people that study just communities and try to understand what kind of competition occurs between different species and what kind of interactions they have. At the end of the year, we'll have enough time to talk about things like parasitism and so forth. So those will be important aspects of community ecology. Once we start factoring in the abiotic or the non-living components of an environment, then we're going to be looking at the ecosystem level. And to remember, abiotic means non-living, but technically anything that is made by things that are living. So for example, the dead remains of a deer, for example, even though the deer itself is not living, it is made out of tissues that were once alive. So that would be considered biotic or living, even though the deer overall is not. So abiotic factors are going to be things like rocks and water, but also conditions like weather, like climate. We can also, if you're looking at an aquatic ecosystem, there's going to be a lot having to do with salinity and currents and that kind of thing are all parts of ecosystems, as would temperature and rain and all that. So understanding how the abiotic factors influence where populations can and cannot live is going to be a really important idea here for ecosystem ecologists. And we're going to really be looking a lot at the ecosystem level because there's different organisms within an area and they're constantly exchanging matter and energy, not between each other, but also with the environment. So that is the ecosystem level. And finally, the different biomes on Earth are just different ecosystems that have similar structures and similar factors to them. But then we can look at the biosphere, which is all of the living things on Earth as well as the places that they live. Although when we break down the biosphere a little, we can kind of tease out the living things with the non-living things. So in your Blue Book, make sure before the test that you have the ecosystem, biosphere, ecosystem, community and population pages all taken care of. So in this picture, I've just drawn example of the population would be the deer population. Once you throw in the trees and the different species that might be present, that would be what makes the community. Once you include the abiotic things such as amount of sunlight and maybe wind and precipitation and mountainous structures and so forth, that makes up the ecosystem, till finally the biosphere is all places on Earth where life can exist. Okay, so when we're looking at Earth's spheres, make sure you know all four. Biosphere encompasses to some degree the other three. although, as I said, we can tease those out. So the biosphere, we can look at it just from the perspective of the things that are actually alive on Earth. The geosphere is the rocky material, sand, dirt, boulders, mountains, all of that stuff. The hydrosphere is anywhere where water exists, and the atmosphere would be the gases that surround the Earth. And in our blue book, there is this image here. And so what we're most concerned with, obviously, is the biosphere. But the biosphere is going to interact a lot, exchanging matter and energy with the atmosphere and the hydrosphere and the geosphere. So things like carbon are going to be passed back and forth in different forms between the biosphere and the atmosphere, for example. And there is movement, all throughout all of this, but we just don't care as much about those because we care about the living stuff. Okay. Now, we talked in the chemistry unit about matter and energy. So just to review, when we're talking about matter, we know that matter cannot be created or destroyed. In the context of an ecosystem, in the context of more than just one small chemical reaction, the same law is going to apply. No more matter is coming to Earth or exiting Earth, with very few exceptions. And in terms of the entire universe, the amount of matter is constant. It is not changing. It's not being destroyed or created. And that means that within an ecosystem, matter has to be recycled, going from one form to the other. It's why the carbon in your body may have at one point been in a rock, and it may have at one point been in a dinosaur. And we can use what are called biogeochemical cycles to describe how matter moves throughout the different spheres of Earth. So different biogeochemical cycles may look at, for example, carbon, or they can look at, probably not hydrogen as much, nitrogen, phosphorus, that kind of thing, to see when is it in the biosphere, how does it get to the atmosphere, how does it get back into the biosphere or into any of the other locations where there could be a reservoir or a location where it stays for a long time. Okay. I'm going to talk a lot in this unit about usable versus unusable matter, but what I really mean is kind of an organic versus inorganic, and what is usable to some isn't usable to all. So all elements can exist in different forms. The organic forms are those that are found in the biosphere, in living organisms or made by living organisms. So lots of carbons attached to hydrogens or carbons attached to other carbons. These are going to be, as I just said, incorporated all throughout the biosphere. And we're also going to find it in the geosphere, because as organisms die, they can kind of biodegrade into the soil. So the soil and the geosphere are the biosphere and geosphere combine together to make up soils. Also, fossil fuels are the remains of organic material that have settled and been compressed by the geosphere. On the flip side of that, inorganic molecules are those that have very few or no carbon to hydrogen bonds and no carbon to carbons. Very, very simple, and these are things that we tend to see more often in the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere. So on the organic side, we're looking at those 4 classes of organic molecules that we looked at in our last unit. For the inorganic matter, things like different types of air, water, minerals, rocks, and salts are all considered inorganic. Okay. Then we can flip and start looking at energy. Now, matter and energy, both of them, cannot be created or destroyed. There's nothing different there for energy, but the difference is that energy is constantly being transformed from one form to another, and every single time energy transforms, let's say from kinetic to potential, from chemical energy to sound energy, any of those conversions are going to cause some of the energy to be converted to heat. And because no organisms can use heat for their life processes, heat is considered kind of a lost form of energy. So it's not that it's being destroyed, it's not that it's really lost, but in terms of usable energy, that energy does decrease because of what is lost as heat. For example, when we look at photosynthesis, sunlight is converted into chemical energy in the plant. Each of those conversions that occur is going to result in a little bit of energy being lost as heat, and different organisms are more or less efficient depending on what their life processes are. Just like we looked at with matter, not all organisms can use all forms of energy. Different forms of life can use electromagnetic energy, chemical energy, what we call gradients can be used as energy. But almost no organism can use heat, or at least not heat by itself. So if we're recapping, in both matter and energy, again, that compare and contrast piece. For comparison, matter is not created or destroyed. Energy is not created or destroyed. But the consequence of those are a little bit different. In matter, we know that matter is recycled. That means that we have these biogeochemical cycles where carbon atoms, for example, can move through from one place to another. On the flip side, energy, we say, moves through an ecosystem. There is a source, there is all these transformations, and eventually it gets lost as heat. Because of that, we're going to need a constant source of new usable energy, which, as you can guess, is going to be sunlight. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the different members of an ecosystem. That is, the different types of populations and classes of organisms that you might find living in a given area. The base of all food pyramids, food webs, all this stuff are going to be the autotrophs. They're the ones that are capable of making their own food, so we're going to be calling them self-eating. And when we say they make their own food, that doesn't mean that they're like chefs. In fact, what they're doing is they're using energy from sources that nobody else can use, usually from sunlight, and they're using matter that nobody else can use, and those are going to be inorganic sources. So they're the ones that are going to be making the proteins and lipids and carbs and nucleic acids. Everybody else has to rely on the autotroph to get at least some of those organic sources. And because they are producing everything that the rest of the ecosystem is going to need, the autotrophs are often referred to as producers, or you may see them referred to as primary producers. So your examples here of autotrophs are what are known as chemoautotrophs or photoautotrophs, although we'll mainly focus on the photo. The photoautotrophs use sunlight for energy, and these are going to be plants, algae, and some bacteria. If you're not an autotroph, then you have to rely on the autotrophs for your source of matter and energy, and for that reason, these are sometimes referred to as other eaters, hetero meaning other, troph meaning eating, and these guys are consumers. They're using the material and the energy that have been made by the plants, by the algae, by some bacteria, by photosynthesis, essentially, and they're consuming them. They are somehow getting those nutrients and energy into their into themselves to be able to do whatever they need to do. Okay. Now we can look at consumers on a level by level. That breaks it down pretty simply for the most part. So we can have primary consumers. They're the ones that are going to eat the producers. So they're the first level to be eating the producers. From there, a secondary consumer would then eat the primary consumer, a tertiary consumer would then eat the secondary, and a quaternary would then eat the tertiary. So if you're looking at a food web, a food chain where one thing eats another, then these different levels, primary, secondary, tertiary, and so forth, make it really very simplified. However, we know that it's a lot more complex than that. So it's also useful to look at different consumers based on descriptions. So herbivores are also called primary consumers because they're eating the producers, but specifically we're looking at animals that eat plants. Animals that eat other animals, whether they're secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, anywhere up from there. Carnivores are those that are going to be eating living animals or eating tissues from organisms that are still alive. So even if you eat the deer and it's dead, you're still eating living tissues. And an omnivore, this is what most of us are. Omnivores are going to eat plants, so producers, as well as other animals. So because of that, sometimes we're primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. Really depends on what we're eating at the moment. Scavengers are organisms that don't necessarily go out and kill something. They're going to find anything that has been dead, and they're going to pick at it to be able to pull the matter and energy, the meat, off of those organisms. And detritivores are going to be the last of the animals to be able to get any kind of nutrition from a dead organism. So detritivores can eat decaying plant matter, decaying animal matter, eat the bacteria that are on the decay. We can kind of skip this. And then finally, any organic matter that remains can be used by the decomposers for their energy and for their matter. And in all of these cases, each time we say organic matter is used, it then becomes converted into an inorganic source of matter. So decomposers are going to be bacteria, along with our fungi, like different mushrooms. So now we can start to look at how matter and energy move. In terms of energy is always coming in from sunlight and being captured by the producers. And about 10% of that energy gets incorporated into the bodies of the producer in such a way that it becomes available to the primary consumer. That is, if the producer is able to capture 10,000 kilocalories of energy, then only 1/10 of that, only 10%, becomes available to the primary consumers. And that means that the other 9,000 kilocalories is lost. And where does it go? Well, it's used up by the autotrophs over the course of its lifetime, and eventually gets lost as heat. So that usable energy is constantly declining, and the heat in the universe is constantly increasing. And as you work your way up a food web or any kind of food pyramid, you'll notice that gets logarithmically smaller until eventually you get up to quaternary and higher level, and there are very, very little amounts of energy that remain for them, which is why they tend to have so few of them in a given ecosystem. We can talk about food chains. Remember with food chains that your arrows are always going to represent the movement of matter and energy. So matter and energy from the autotroph is going to move to the primary consumer. From there, it's going to move to the secondary consumer. So the autotroph gives up, and I'm using air quotes there, gives up its energy and matter to the primary consumer when it is eaten. So you'll see right here, let me open it. Right, this arrow pointing from a plant to the mouse indicates that the mouse is getting its matter and energy from the plant. That is, that matter and energy moves this way up the food chain. So don't think of it as who eats whom. Instead, think of it as that flow of matter and energy. And of course, we know that very, very, very few organisms rely solely on one food type. And so we can look at a more holistic view of a ecosystem by looking at a food web, and that's just incorporating a bunch of different food chains together. So finally, if you take a look at your blue book, sorry, I know we did this together, but that's okay. If we take a look at our blue book, there we go. Essentially what we've talked about is this, that matter is recycled in an ecosystem, and we call these biogeochemical cycles. And that means that the matter coming in at the autotroph level is going to kind of work its way up. Each time one level eats the level below it, or each time anyone dies, they're going to give off some of that matter to these guys over here. These are the decomposers and detritivores. Okay. Helps if I label all of these for you just in case. So producers down here, primary consumers, secondary consumers, also called herbivores, and then these guys would also be called your carnivores, producers down at the bottom. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit confusing. So to kind of recap, matter is coming in to the producers in the form of inorganic molecules and then being passed either up the food chain or eventually going to the decomposers and detritivores as they die. And every time that matter is used up, it gets returned back into the inorganic sources, either in the hydrosphere or geosphere or atmosphere. If we look at energy, energy from sunlight comes in. The producers are then able to utilize that energy and convert it into organic molecules. That's going to combine with the inorganic sources and move its way up the food chain. And every time a conversion occurs, some energy is lost as heat. Okay, so I hope this makes sense in light of the fact that we've gone through most of the unit before I finally posted this. And if you've got any questions, comment below.